Hi everyone, welcome to the last week, and this is an additional information about compositing and post effects. So I wanted to add this because some of this material is not mentioned in the finals, and I think that's a nice addition to what you already know. So I'll go over every effect and give you some notes on adding glows and other stuff. So first element is fire. So for the fire, to make it more interesting and cooler, so we usually add glow. For the glow, make sure that the glow is more saturated and a bit darker than the main fire. So for example, if our fire is kind of yellow and the background is not very light, it's pretty dark. So for example, we'll take this fire, I'll exaggerate it a bit to make it cooler. And this has like yellowish, you can make it orange, more orange. And for example, very bright center. So for example, we have this fire. We need this orange and yellow to be separated. And then I'll adjust the colors a bit. Okay, so this is our orange layer. And then for the orange layer, when I add the glow, it should be darker and more saturated. For example, here, I can add either the dark orange glow or like a reddish glow, kind of red. You can see that the glow of this fire in the photo is pretty much red. So we can add red glow. Shouldn't be too big, but quite noticeable. Okay, and I think we can push a bit like this. Okay, and so for the bright part, for the bright layer, we can make it even brighter, I think. And the glow can be, so we can make it quite bright. And the glow can be like yellowish because the layer is quite saturated and bright. So we can have something like this. It will be smaller glows than, for example, than on the outside layer, but it still will be noticeable. So our fire looks like this. You see? So for candles or gasoline or something like this, like a smaller fire, we usually have like or even for torches. So we have an area where there is not much visible bright fire, bright area, and it is close to the source of the flame. So there is less oxygen here, less things to burn, so there is not really much of the flame here. Then it is more orangish or pinkish or something like this, and then we have the bright core. It can go a bit orange at the top or at the tips on the edges. You can see it here. And then we have kind of a fall off with a glow. And you can notice that the candle itself has like orangish glow. So we can imagine that even like having this as a foundation, as a base, then for example, I'll add something more orange here, maybe more yellow first, brighter. Then on a separate layer, more orange. Maybe darker and more saturated. And of course the shape should vary, so it's not always the same scene. Then we can erase the middle part. And it can be erased with a soft shape. And this can be done in After Effects as well. So you can erase it with the hard shape or animate it with like this kind of cut here, and then blur it in After Effects or something similar. Okay, so we have something like this. And then when we add it, we add the gradient to this layer, so it's more pink. So we can add a gradient to this layer. This layer will have like a gradient from white to a bit of yellow at the bottom. This can be again done in After Effects or something like that. So it should be a pretty subtle gradient, nothing too big. And then in this layer, you'll add a gradient for the bottom to make it more kind of darker blue. And then when we apply glow, again, the bright white layer will have the brightest glow. So the bright white layer can have a glow that is like orangish or yellowish. And the glow is always darker than the fire itself and a bit more saturated usually. Doesn't have to be super big. I would blur the orange area a bit. And I would blur the edge of the yellow area a bit. So we get something like this. And you can see that it feels like a candle from far away. We can actually make a blur or a glow on the white layer a bit stronger. So if the background is bright, so if we make a bright background, then let's not make it super bright, but something bright. Then the candle to be visible would have to be like very bright as well. So maybe it will become a combination of very bright yellow, and this area will show us the background. So this area is transparent and it shows us what's behind the flame. So we'll see more of a blue here. So if I drag this flame to this area, I would have to change the colors a bit because it's not that bright or bright enough. So right now, if I did that, You see the blue layer? It's dark. It's darker than the background. And the flame, it adds light to the light that we have already. So to match the new background, the glow on the white layer should be brighter. Otherwise, it's too dark because the brightness of the fire depends on the lighting of the scene. If it's very light in the scene, then the fire will be also white brighter because it adds to the light that is already in the environment. So then we can make the blur more yellow, a bit less saturated, or maybe somewhat orange, but a bit brighter. Huh? Okay. And the most important part is to fix this blue here, because this blue became very dark. So blue has to change quite a bit. We can give it a brighter. So it has to be brighter to fit the brighter scene. So again, effects depends on the background as well, especially effects like fire, because fire, it shows the light from the scene and it adds light to it. Honestly, I would add like even bigger glow, maybe more orangish glow to the light layers that we have. Because we're stylizing effects, we can add a bit of darker glow. Huh? Where is it? Why are you here? I can cheat a bit. To make it more visible, we'll use a bit darker glow around it, further from it. And you can see it here, so we have this yellow fire with a tiny bit of yellow glow around it, and we have this orange fire with this red glow around it. So for the water, oh, the other effect that we can add sometimes is a bit of a blur at the top. So you see how when we get to the top, the fire gets more stretched out and it has these soft edges. So sometimes if we're doing the full comp and you need to match it to more complex, more textured environment and stuff, we can add an effect called motion blur. And you can find similar effects in like After Effects and so on. So the point here is that we add blur only to a specific area, only to the very top of the fire. So you see, we're adding this blur, this nice variation, but only to the top of the fire, which moves most. And the same can be done with like fire puffs or fire like stream going somewhere. So we only add it to the part that move forward and moves the fastest. And right here you can see it at the very top. So we can add a bit of blur here It's the very top of the candle. And it adds this nice touch, and we can color it a bit. So for the water doesn't usually need a lot of post effects, but you can add a subtle blur. So for example, here, if we would comp it completely ourselves, we can add a tiny bit of blur at these kind of moments. And it should be a very precise blur only to the edges that are moving like forward. So this kind of stuff. So it only add a bit of blur to these areas, a tiny bit of blur, only blur in the very edges of it. So from this to this, from this to this, and only when we need it. Water can be great to add some subtle gradients and textures. The water surface especially, you can see that there is a subtle gradient from like more darker blue to more cyan or this kind of blue. We have the gradient over here, and this is generally hard edges. We can blur it a tiny bit. And for the foam that's very brightly lit, we can add a tiny bit of glow, a tiny bit of bright glow, but just a tiny bit of glow here. For water drops and raindrops and all that stuff, we don't usually need much effects. We can add a tiny bit of glow, like you see here, a tiny bit of blue glow around here, because the sky is quite dark. And here, since there is a sun hitting it here, and it is a rainy day, it's really cool to add some moments of like lens flare or just highlights being illuminated, having some blur, some nice lens flares and flares in general. I can notice it here. So we can add a bit of like blur. This is a very tiny bit of blur to the highlights. That shows how bright it is and how much it is illuminated. And otherwise, we can add a very subtle gradient, but not too much of it. It's a very subtle gradient, like changes the color a tiny little bit. So for the lightning, again, for the lightning and stuff like that, for the energy type of effect and magic type of effect, we usually add glows. So we add a darker and more saturated glow. We can mix a couple different colors of the glow. So for example, this can have like, okay, this has like dark blue glow, but first we have like brighter, green or cyan kind of glow. So we can have something like that. And we can add, of course, different types of glow. You can notice a nice glow here that goes from yellow to more pinkish or something like this. We can add glow to sparks again. Here it has a tiny bit of like red glow. Here we have very nice green glow. And for explosions, for the smoke, we don't usually need a lot of effects. We can add a bit of texture to the explosion smoke or to the smoke in general. We can add a tiny bit of glow or motion blur at the edges. So let's see. For example, we have now let's just draw it. So for example, we have smoke. And it's a small kind of rising smoke. So 90% of the time, like small smoke like this will be transparent. It will show the background behind it, and it will have some sort of transparency. And we can add a bit of blur. A tiny bit of blur. And we can add a tiny bit of motion blur. In the direction of the motion. It should always match the direction of the motion, ideally. And even this may be too heavy. It can be a very subtle effect. And this is a more advanced scene, but we can then use this as a mask and have like different various levels of transparency in it. So we can actually like only keep the edges of the smoke mostly visible and combine like a couple of these. So we can have a couple transparent smokes with a delay, maybe with a different transform options, and delay the smoke a bit. So one is, for example, rising earlier, one later, or you can like use the same smoke loop, but delay one of it to create more interesting and complex shapes when you need to create more complex smoke. And we can blur this one, this first one. This helps us create a sense of smokiness because it has like additional complexity and the softness of the smoke. So for heavy billowing smoke, and this is only needed in some cases when the image is more complex, 3D, stuff like that, with a lot of gradients and variations. If the image is more flat and simple in terms of style, we don't really need that. We can just get away with like a bit of transparency at the top, maybe a tiny bit of blur, not much. And we can see that, for example, here we have the smoke, and the image is flat, and there aren't many scenes, so it's just a transparent smoke, so we don't add much blur. It's a tiny bit of blur on it, and it's just transparent. And so if the smoke is heavy and like billowing, so for the smoke like this, we need just a tiny little bit of blur, maybe some texture or a gradient, and not much more than this. And this kind of smoke is most of the time non-transparent, so it doesn't show the surroundings because it's so heavy, it's so billowing, that it doesn't show the surroundings behind it. It's kind of a heavier smoke. It's not transparent, and we can see it in real life as well. For example, here, it's not really showing the environment behind it. It's very heavy. But you can add a bit of blur on the edges and a tiny bit of gradient because it's not the same shade throughout. It's kind of a rounded shaded volume. So we have like a gradient here, a gradient here, a gradient generally from this to this gets lighter, and this is the darkest, and so on. So that's kind of things that we need to remember, and that I help you a bit to understand what kind of Compositing in general, in terms of approach, can be needed for each element. And of course, I haven't mentioned all of them. It's just an overview. And you can do it with various tools. So hope that helps you, and wish you good luck with your animations.